everyone. Good morning. Happy Friday. So let's go ahead and get started as I struggle bust the clicker. As Glenn mentioned, I'm Tabitha Ogle. I'm the owner and operator of Ogle Coaching and Consulting. I have a master's in industrial organization psychology because when you leave respiratory, you have to have a field that no one knows about and no one can understand what it is. So the focus on this conversation is about becoming a leaderless leader. The idea isn't to skip happily into the fire of healthcare. It's to get prepared with proper PPE as we walk into healthcare, trying to make the best of what we can to ensure our own career longevity, to ensure our own empowerment, and to really feel the influence and impact that we have on what matters, and that's the patients. So some of the key topics I'm going to be talking about are social programming, power of perspective, power of influence, climate impact. And what I mean by climate is not the weather, it's the organizational climate, and I'll define that later in the slides. And then, of course, conflict resolution. So who am I and what gives me any right to talk about this topic? Well, from this slide, I'm an Army-trained respiratory therapist. As soon as I graduated respiratory through the military, I got my orders for deployment. I had about 6 months of pre-deployment and combat training before I went overseas and served as a respiratory therapist. When I was overseas, I was the head of my department in the OR staff. This was a while back. I was 23 years old. And what I noticed right away is that no one in this new unit that I was deploying with really embodied the leadership style that I needed. And now being a freshly appointed leader, I had to figure out what I was going to do in order to lead those around me. My deep passion to advocate for patients and my intensity on the seriousness of my impact really led me to this topic. And then academic-wise, once I finished my master's, I was able to key in what those observational experiences really meant. So, leaderless leader, what does that mean? That means we get to be what we define as a leader. Instead of looking to another human to lead and guide us, why don't we reflect on ourselves on the way we need to be guided? Because when we search for another human to tell us how to do things and who to be and what respiratory looks like in that role, we're ultimately going to be misguided. So what I ended up doing during my deployment was I made a list of all the things I needed from a leader. And then instead of searching for that through another person, I worked on ways to become that and embody it. And by doing so, I found that I had more control and autonomy, which is empowering to all of us. The trouble with looking for another human to lead us right now is that there is a massive misalignment between the organizational values and missions and what's being reflected on the clinical side or bedside inside healthcare. That causes a palpable mistrust with the organization. And of course, that mistrust is projected onto our leaders. Even if our manager or director or supervisor are doing everything perfectly, we're not going to be able to trust them the way we should because we can't trust the organizations right now. We want to be part of something bigger, and we want to put patients first. But when we're not seeing that or being supported by that from the organization, it's hard to really trust the process. The challenges with being led by another human is that humans ultimately make mistakes over and over again, or they do something and we perceive it differently. Their intentions and the way we perceive it is not always the same. So again, there's that mistrust, there's that conflict, and it creates a lack of enjoyment going to work. And this is going to lead me into social programming. And you guys are probably like, what is this girl talking about? So I'm going to define social programming from a personal level, and then I'll explain how it's reflected through the organizations. Social programming is our deep-seated psyche beliefs, right? These are our gender role beliefs. These are our religious beliefs. These are our family dynamic beliefs, and those play a huge role in the way we perceive things and the way we interact with others. This also sets the tone for how we perceive our achievements and a job well done. And it feeds into those two basic social needs that we all have, to feel unique and to feel like we belong. And we all want to feel unique in here. I mean, all of us are respiratory therapists. We picked a role that no one knows. We have to constantly explain to everyone, no, I'm not a nurse. No, I'm not the nurse. So has it reflected into organizations is those deep-seated social programming beliefs play a role into the hierarchy inside the healthcare organization. So if we're someone who really values that social hierarchy, we're going to be very role specific inside healthcare, meaning, oh, I can't tell you that, that's the doctor's job. Oh, I can't do that, that's this person's job. And it creates frustration because, again, having that belief that we have to be led in order to be functional inside an organization at this very moment is going to make it incredibly challenging for us to find enjoyment through our occupation. Inside healthcare right now, any organization and all organizations go through life cycles. They go through birth, maturity, puberty, old age, and sometimes demise. An organization that always comes to light when I think about this is Zappos. Zappos was a great organization. They had great climate and culture within their organization, but they ultimately fizzled. I don't think healthcare is going away anytime soon, but I definitely think healthcare is either going through puberty or a midlife crisis because it is not enjoyable. But with that being said, as much as healthcare has changed and evolved over the years, it can continue to change and evolve now. We just have to be patient with it, and we have to figure out how we can survive it right now. Because we have all invested so much time in ourselves and in our degrees and in our fields that it would be devastating for the patients for some of us to leave. With every passage of the life cycle, a new passage of behaviors and norms and roles emerge. We saw this probably about 10, 15 years ago when they started the wellness everything, and all these little ideas popped up from the operational side of healthcare. Oh, well, we're going to start doing creation health, and we're going to do this health. But over the time, it didn't trickle to clinical side. So the power of perspective. Does anyone know who this guy is? No? All right, good. No one worked at Red Lobster. Cliff Young in 1983 was a 61-year-old gentleman. He was a farmer. He came from a rural farm in Australia. They didn't have a lot of money, so they didn't have horses or machinery. So at night, he would herd the sheep, and it would take 2 or 3 days of him herding these sheep. Well, he wanted to participate in one of those marathon runs, those crazy endurance runs in Australia. It was a total of 543.7 miles. He had never participated in a long run. He had no idea what it was about. He didn't do any research. He didn't have any mindset regarding. He just knew that he could herd sheep, so he could do this race. The first day, everyone laughed at him. The reporters mocked him. Other runners mocked him. They had the medical teams kind of following him because of his little shuffle he was doing while he was running. He was in last place. Everyone had a pattern of sleep and run from training. Cliff didn't know anything about it. So while everyone slept the first night, Cliff kept running. And when everyone slept the next night, Cliff kept running. And Cliff ended up winning the race. He won first place at 61 years old with zero training. And this is how little research Cliff did. He didn't even know there was an award for winning. So when Cliff got the $10,000, instead of taking it back to his farm and being like, problem solved, I no longer have to herd the sheep myself, I can buy a horse. Instead of solving that problem, he shared the winnings with those who raced with him. Because the power of their endurance and the power of influence really changed his power of perspective. It wasn't him running, it was everyone running together. And I bring this up because, one, it makes everyone feel good to hear about Cliff, but also we go into healthcare sometimes solo. But it's not about us, it's about all of us together. A shift in our perspective equals a shift in our influence. Now, I know this sounds a little woohoo, but there's a lot of scientific research backing this information. I didn't pull it out of a Hold Hands and Meditate book. This is all pulled out of social and psychological researches. Our perspective predicts what our day is going to look like. And a perfect example, you wake up, you're in a crappy mood, you got to go to work, you know you're understaffed, and you're already peed off. Every insult, injury, annoyance during the day only adds to that negativity bias that we naturally gravitate towards. There's a difference between judging the day that is going to suck and using discernment. Discernment says, yeah, you know what, we're understaffed, and the last few days have been tough, so I'm going to have to be extra on point today. And I know that it's probably going to not be the best day, but that's okay. That's the difference. We need to start valuing not how crappy the day was, but our ability to learn, grow, and adapt to those crappy days. Honoring the journey that we have and celebrating our ability to overcome and not feeding into that natural negativity bias. By doing so, yeah, today sucked, but you know what? What can I do next shift to keep it from sucking so hard? And we constantly need feedback to grow and adapt and overcome. But looking for that leadership to give us that feedback, it's not always going to be echoed in a way that we can receive it. So we have to understand ourselves enough to reflect in an effective way. A great example of this is after a terrible code, some organizations do a great debrief. Now, if the culture and climate in that organization are healthy, those debriefs can be very empowering. What went right? What went wrong? And how can we change it in the future? But right now, the climate's not great. So some of those debriefings are more about an attack mission. And who gets blamed for everything? Respiratory. So it's important to be able to sit back and say in your car before you go home, you know what, today really sucked. And the code in room 7-4 made things astronomically worse. What role did I play in that? How can I do better in the future? And what can I learn and share with others to keep them from making the same mistakes? And then we need to stop looking at our managers as the almighty, right? Tell me I'm good, tell me I'm great, tell me I'm doing everything right. And start looking at them as valuable resource tools. They hold all the information. They hold the policy and procedures. They hold the best practice. They hold the standard of care. They're a resource for conflict. They're a resource to bounce ideas off of. They're a resource of guidance and growth, but they're not the almighty because they don't understand your perspective because they haven't lived through your experience. They're not going to see it the way you see it, and that's what makes it perfect. Social influence. So this portion has a lot to do with what we see at the bedside and what we're told to ignore at the bedside. There's a really amazing study by, I wrote it down because I always forget their names, John Darley and Bib Lantane. And it's a smoke study that was conducted at Columbia University. And this smoke study had students come in that thought that they were going to be discussing worldviews with research assistants. What they found is when those students went into the room and there was no one in there, and it was just one student, they filled those rooms up with smoke. So much smoke that they couldn't even see in front of them. Some of them were, fanning the smoke away. Only 75% of people got up and actually told someone that their room was filled with smoke. We have such an intense fear of embarrassment that we often don't speak up when we know something is wrong. Now, when they did that study, they've done this study multiple times. So they were like, hold on, let's up the ante. So they brought in 2 students together and they filled up the room with smoke. And with that, they noticed that only 38% reported the smoke because they were expecting the other person to speak up. They were expecting someone else to notice. So they upped the ante again. And they had 2 research assistants sitting at a table when 2 people arrived. And those students arrived, only 10% spoke up. Again, the study has been repeated multiple times, but the results remain the same. We don't speak up because we're waiting for someone else to do it, or we're so afraid that we're going to embarrass or shame someone else. Now, on the clinical aspect, that stuff stays with us. Those moments when we felt like we should have said something, but we didn't, because that's Dr. blah, 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 and sometimes he does that. Or that's Betty, and she's really good at what she does, so I'm just not going to say anything today. But that creates a behavioral norm. And there's a theory called behavioral contagion. And we can see this as superficial as the Stanley cup that someone brings in, and they're like, hey guys, check out my cup. Everyone like it? And then in the next few weeks, everyone at the nurse's station has the same cup, right? But we can also see this as deeply as the patient in room 74 who's getting physically and verbally abusive with staff, and we're not speaking up. So now this is a normal behavior inside our healthcare system, that it's okay not to speak up when patients become physically or verbally abusive to staff, or when doctors throw medical equipment at staff when they're frustrated. It's not acceptable, but we accept it. Our presence is other people's direct experience. That's why they did all the research for patient psychological safety factors in healthcare, because they realized the toxic healthcare climate was impacting patients' psychological well-being, which impacts their quality of life and their length of stay. But there's very little research on employee psychological safety. And when we share our experiences, we intensify them. This can be seen at weddings when everyone cries. This can be seen at funerals when that grief is heavily intense amongst everyone. But this can also be seen at the nurse's station or in the respiratory department when we're all just so over the crap. And it falls into that negativity bias. And the most amplified and intensified emotion is anger and frustration. By doing this, by continuing this behavior of we hate the organization, we're all angry, it only solidifies their position of power. By saying it sucks and there's nothing we can do, it only solidifies their control. So I promised I would define it. Organization culture, I'll start with that first. Organization culture is just making sure I'm not running over. Okay. Organizational culture is the set of beliefs from an organization that distinguishes it from another organization. A lot of the times, this is their mission statement. So inside healthcare, you can hear things like healthcare innovation while putting patients first, right? When that mission is not being reflected at bedside or in the clinical operations, like I mentioned before, it creates a palpable mistrust and frustration with the organization, because we can't live up to this group that we belong to because they're not providing us the resources or tools to do so. And that impacts the organizational climate. The organizational climate is our personal experience inside the organization. There are a ton of different dimensions that measure organizational climate. The diversity within that climate, the fairness, the equity, the justice, the resources. And each department in healthcare has its own climate. And they interact with each other and they feed off of each other. Nurses versus respiratory, X-ray versus respiratory, OR versus ER. And we can hear the way it interacts and intensifies its negative emotions. And it creates a set of beliefs based on that department. So I know everyone can really understand this. When ER calls ICU for report, whoever's on the phone automatically says this patient's going to come with a bed full of crap. Their tube's not going to be in the same place. Their blood gas isn't going to look right. Their IV lines are going to be a mess, right? When nursing calls for an x-ray, well, it's going to take him an hour and 15 minutes to get here. And it creates this set of beliefs where we're now fighting amongst ourselves. And when we're fighting amongst ourselves, the organization is winning, which sounds crazy because most organizations need a healthy workplace climate to increase productivity and to ensure that customers are satisfied. But in healthcare, it's not measured that way. And when we're fighting amongst ourselves and saying that there's all these barriers to change, we can't fight against the organization to create the systematic change we so desperately need. We are in control of our climate. I have attended amazing custodiums through SIAP, which sounds very sci-fi, but it's just the Society of Industrial Organization Psychology, and the Institute of Coaching through Harvard. And I've asked the leading researchers who developed patient psychological safety factors why there isn't any employee psychological safety measures being taken. And their answers are always the same. Healthcare is toxic, that's just the way it is. Repeatedly, I've asked these questions. Healthcare is toxic, it's the way it is. I've talked to CEOs and medical directors and people who are representing healthcare in Congress, and I ask them the same thing. Why aren't we doing anything to protect our employees' psychological safety factors? Healthcare is toxic, it's the way it is. Even with the ample research showing that the career longevity for healthcare workers has significantly declined over the last 10 years, their answer is always the same. It's toxic, it's the way it is. They look at us as we're replaceable and we're not. We're impactful. We create massive influence in the healthcare system and for our communities. Using our impact of influence, we can change the climate and narrative. Instead of coming in with that negative perspective that today is going to suck and being ready and geared up to fight other departments, we can unify as a team. It's possible when we work together and we see each other as equals. This obviously benefits ourselves, our teams, the organizations, the patients in which we encounter, and the community in which we serve. So naturally, how do we handle the conflict? Because conflict happens in healthcare. So a conflict style that I like to use is one by Dr. Dudley E. Floyd. He is remarkable. He helped North Carolina desegregate a lot of their schools once they should have already been desegregated. And he had to handle a lot of troubling situations. So he created the what, so what, and what now method. Has anyone heard of this? Okay. So when we're faced with a conflict, we naturally get defensive because we feel like we're right. This is what we feel, and we're passionate about how we feel it. So if we enter that conflict going, what's the issue? Well, the issue is Dr. Hamburger. I hope that there's not a hamburger. Dr. Hamburger wants this patient on CPAP, and they're clearly not stable, right? That's the conflict. So what? Well, if I put this patient on CPAP, they could code. They could not do well. And for him, if we don't put the patient on CPAP, how are we supposed to know that they won't do well? What now? Where do we find the resolve in the conflict? Do we tell Dr. Hamburger, hey, if you want him on CPAP, you got to stand in here with me while I do it? And someone grab the crash cart? Or does Dr. Hamburger say, okay, well, let's kind of wean down the pressure support or the PEEP or the FiO2 prior to doing CPAP? It's entering the conflict with a state of curiosity. And when we do that, it breaks down the defensiveness. If we enter every conflict saying, okay, I'm 90% right in how I feel, but what's their 10%? What's their 10% on being right in how they feel? And instead of coming in going, oh my God, I can't believe I'm having this conversation with him right now, entering it and going, all right, what are your views and how are you seeing it? And it works in relationships too. I'm married to an electrical engineer, and I don't know if you guys know any. They are very stubborn and fixed-minded. So I use this with my husband, though I don't think he knows about it yet, where I enter in a state of curiosity on how is this man seeing the situation right now? And when that doesn't work, it's an artful act of insubordination. Anyone who's worked with me knows I am very tactful in my insubordination. And you have to be. We're not drones. We have to protect ourselves. As we've seen from cases, we have to protect ourselves. And that means when Dr. Hamburger says, I'm leaving, I don't care, put them on CPAP, I want them on for 30 minutes, no questions, no ifs, ands, or buts. Cool, super cool. I'm going to document that. Spoke with Dr. Hamburger, once patient on CPAP, expressed concern regarding patient's increased PEEP, will be at bedside during CPAP procedure, period. That way, if something ultimately happens to that patient, you're saying, listen, I didn't want to do it. I told him I didn't want to do it. I told him why I didn't want to do it, but he wanted me to do it. Artful insubordination is super important right now because we're being pushed into environments that are unsafe. We're being staffed in situations that make us feel like we cannot provide the care that we're meant to provide. And there's nothing wrong with documenting to cover your butt. I know we're told we're not supposed to. But in my 15 years as a respiratory therapist, I always covered my own butt. When a physician demanded a freshly born baby go on 100% FiO2, even though their stats were perfect on room air, I documented that. After I had a conversation with him on why I was concerned about this use of FiO2 for this patient demographic. And every time I saw that physician and he requested the same thing, I documented that. When he requested arterial sticks on kids who were setting beautifully on room air, I documented that. Was I his favorite person? Absolutely not. He told me all the time he hated me. But I made sure that if someone looked at that chart and wondered why that patient had ROP, that I was covered. That I said I didn't feel comfortable doing this, but I was told to do this, and here it is. It also made me feel better when I got in the car because I wasn't sitting with it. It wasn't stewing. It wasn't haunting me while I was trying to fall asleep at night. We are often told to ignore things that are problematic inside healthcare. Instead of emailing the right people, instead of talking to the person about it, instead of reporting it. We see this a lot right now with patients being physically and verbally abusive with us. When we go to tell someone, oh yeah, we already know about it, so don't even worry. No, I'm worried. And I'm gonna email you and I'm gonna CC this person and this person and this person. Does it make us a nuisance? Sure. But sometimes you have to be the squeaky wheel to solve the problem. And I would rather be a nuisance every day than have something like that sit with me when that patient becomes more aggressive and attacks the person to follow me in shift. We have to be able to reduce the emotional labor from our occupation so that we can go home and rest easy at night. Because it's costly. We're everywhere. We are like bed bugs. We are in every room. We are on every floor. And we are constantly blamed. So email it, right? CC, be a nuisance. When I worked in a pediatric cardiovascular surgery unit, I noticed something that was wrong and I didn't report it. And it still stays with me today. And I didn't report it because when I spoke about it, I was pushed away. Hey, I'm really concerned with this charge nurse's behavior. She sleeps and then she screams. She falls asleep and then she screams. She goes into patient's room. She's not wearing gloves. She's pulling blood. She's getting medicine. And I brought it up. I brought it up with their nursing manager. Oh, yeah. She does that. It's okay. It's fine. Like, is it though? I reported it to my manager and director. Hey, I have concerns, X, Y, and Z. And it was blown away. It still bothers me. So, final thoughts. Organizations ultimately fail when they don't put employees first. All of this, putting patients first, leading with patient care, it's all baloney. They're just saying profit first. Because each one of us took an oath when we took our test, saying that we would put patients first. And nurses take their oath saying that they'll put patients first. And physicians take their oath saying that they'll put patients first. A little redundant if you ask me for healthcare organizations to repeat that, because we're already doing it. They really want to put patients first, they have to put us first. And that doesn't mean paying us millions of dollars, though I think we all would appreciate that. It's by showing us we have value. And that's not giving us a gift bag during respiratory week. It's acknowledging how impactful we are to the organization and not saying, if you don't like it here, you can go somewhere else. It's like here, it's like this everywhere, so get used to it. If you're looking for a pat on the head, you're not going to get it from us. But we should. Because we're taking care of the challenging patients. We're handling the challenging staff during the most challenging time. So I want to thank you all for the amazing work that you guys have done during this really challenging time. It's hard, and some days super suck. But when we look at each other, we're in it together, not against each other. Honoring that each of us have a different skill set, and honoring each other that we all have room to grow and change, and that we're resourceful to each other as a team. With that, do you have any questions?
Say this, but I think, unfortunately, it took something like COVID for the world to kind Crystal, for the world to see what respiratory was all about, and that is so sad to say. We work for organizations. I worked for organizations for 40 years, and respiratory was always, like you said, on the backside. And in the last 3 years, they have been in the front, and people have praised us, and it is a great feeling.
Oh, I love that.
For many organizations on the West Coast, and I feel like prior to the pandemic, there were staffing problems, but obviously not post-pandemic, but now it's exacerbated. It seems like a lot of organizations are very reactive right now, trying to recruit respiratory therapists. How do organizations regain trust from,
That's a solid question. And this was a conversation I had with the CEO not too long ago, where he was just, healthcare's toxic. I'm like, yeah, but we have to solve the problems, don't we? Right now, like I said, healthcare is either going through puberty or midlife crisis. So during that stage, it's hard to really exude the trust that we need as employees to feel comfortable, right? But it's putting their words to action. So if they're saying they're being innovative and putting patients first, start expressing that to staff of the stages that they're taking and the measures that they're taking to get there, right? All we need during change is information. Otherwise, we're going to talk amongst ourselves and create another narrative that's not necessarily reflective of what the organization wants to do. So if the organization looks at all of us and says, yes, we have a deficit of staffing by 15%, and unfortunately around June and July, we might have a larger one. Here's the steps we're taking to actively improve that. If you guys know anyone who wants to work at the organization, holler. You know, it's creating that transparency. Just like in any relationship, in order for us to trust, there has to be transparency and communication. Otherwise, the narratives we come up with are self-destructive at times. Yeah. Huh? Oh, what's Cliff doing now? Well, unfortunately, he passed. It was 83. He was 61. I want to say he passed in like early 2000s. But he actually ran the race 2 or 3 times after that, but never received first place again. Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope you found the information helpful.